The personal tragedy that had driven Dr. Sarah Williams away from faith 25 years earlier became the weapon she wielded that night against Jonathan Roumie, standing before hundreds at the University of Chicago's packed lecture hall. The loss of her 6-year-old daughter Emma to leukemia had transformed a once devout Christian woman into academia's most ruthless opponent of religious belief, and she had weaponized her grief into philosophical arguments that had left countless believers shattered and speechless. "Tell me, Mr. Roumie," she said, her voice carrying decades of rage and pain, "where was your loving Jesus when my little girl was dying in agony, begging me to make the pain stop?" She expected the same stammered platitudes, the same weak deflections she had heard from every religious leader who had tried to console her. Instead, Jonathan's response would force her to confront not just the possibility of God's existence, but the terrifying prospect that her daughter's death might have meaning beyond her worst nightmares. The University of Chicago's Mandel Hall had not seen this level of anticipation for an academic event in decades. Students began lining up at dawn for an evening debate that had been promoted as faith versus reason, the ultimate confrontation. The event had originated from an unlikely source, Dr. Sarah Williams herself, who had issued a public challenge to Jonathan Roumie after watching several episodes of The Chosen with what she described as professional disgust at the intellectual dishonesty of modern Christian entertainment. Her challenge, posted on her widely read academic blog and shared thousands of times across social media, had been direct and provocative. If the actor who portrays Jesus believes his character represents truth rather than mythology, he should be willing to defend that position against actual scholarship and logic. Jonathan's acceptance of the challenge had surprised many in both academic and entertainment circles. Most actors would have declined such an obvious trap, especially when facing someone of Dr. Williams' formidable reputation. At 52, she held endowed chairs at both Harvard and the University of Chicago, had published 15 books on philosophy and religion, and had spent the past 2 decades systematically dismantling religious belief in public forums across America and Europe. Her debates were legendary not just for their intellectual rigor, but for their emotional brutality. She had a particular talent for identifying the personal wounds that drove people to faith, and then exposing those wounds to public scrutiny. But Jonathan had not only accepted the challenge, he had suggested they make it a charity fundraiser, with all proceeds going to childhood cancer research. The gesture had been seen by Dr. Williams' supporters as a cynical attempt to gain sympathy points, while his defenders viewed it as evidence of his genuine commitment to Christian principles. Either way, it had guaranteed maximum media attention and a packed auditorium filled with philosophy students, theology professors, journalists, and curious members of the public who had come to witness what many expected to be an intellectual massacre. Dr. Sarah Williams had not always been academia's most feared opponent of religious belief. 26 years earlier, she had been Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a young philosophy professor at Northwestern University, with a growing reputation for her work on ethics and meaning, and a devout Christian whose faith informed both her scholarship and her personal life. She had met her husband David at a church young adults group, and their marriage had been built on shared faith, intellectual compatibility, and dreams of raising children who would grow up knowing both the love of God and the joy of learning. Emma had been their miracle baby, born after 3 years of struggling with infertility and multiple miscarriages. From the moment she entered the world, Emma had been precocious, curious, and filled with the kind of unshakable joy that seemed to radiate from children who have never doubted they are loved. By age 4, she was reading at a second-grade level and asking theological questions that impressed the pastor of their Methodist church. She would sit through entire Sunday services without fidgeting, absorbing every word of the sermons, and later asking her parents to explain concepts like grace, redemption, and eternal life. The first symptoms appeared just after Emma's 5th birthday: unusual bruising, persistent fatigue, and a pallor that couldn't be explained by normal childhood illnesses. The diagnosis of acute lymphoblastic leukemia had arrived like a meteor strike, obliterating the careful life Sarah and David had built and thrusting them into a world of hospitals, chemotherapy protocols, and statistical probabilities that seemed to shift daily. Emma had faced her treatment with the same curiosity and courage she brought to everything else, asking doctors about their procedures, befriending nurses, and maintaining an almost supernatural optimism that both inspired and broke her parents' hearts. For 8 months, Emma's faith had remained unshakable even as her small body was ravaged by both disease and treatment. She would pray before each chemotherapy session, thanking God for her doctors and asking Him to help other sick children. When her hair fell out, she had declared that she looked like a beautiful bald eagle and that God must have special plans for eagles. When the pain became overwhelming and she would cry through the night, she would ask her mother to sing hymns because Jesus is probably singing too, and I want to sing with him. The end had come suddenly, as it often does with pediatric cancers. Emma's condition deteriorated rapidly over a span of just 4 days, transforming her from a hopeful little girl who still believed in miraculous healing to a child whose body could no longer sustain life. The final night had been a horror that Sarah could never fully describe to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. Hours of Emma begging for the pain to stop, pleading with her mother to make it better, and finally asking the question that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. Why won't Jesus help me? Sarah had sat by Emma's bedside, holding her daughter's tiny hand and watching the monitors that tracked her failing vital signs, searching desperately for words of comfort that wouldn't come. Every prayer she had ever learned felt like mockery in the face of such senseless suffering. Every theological explanation she had ever heard crumbled under the weight of her daughter's agony. When Emma finally slipped into unconsciousness for the last time, Sarah felt something die inside herself that was deeper and more fundamental than grief. It was the death of her ability to believe in a universe governed by love rather than random cruelty. The funeral had been attended by hundreds of people from their church and university communities, all offering condolences and assurances that Emma was in a better place and that God had called her home for reasons we can't understand. Each well-meaning platitude had felt like salt in an open wound. The pastor's eulogy, describing Emma as an angel who was only loaned to this earth for a brief time, had filled Sarah with a rage so profound she had to excuse herself from her own daughter's funeral service. In the months that followed, David had clung to his faith as a source of comfort and meaning, while Sarah found herself unable to pray, unable to attend church, and unable to maintain any belief in a God who would allow innocent children to suffer and die. Their marriage, already strained by grief, couldn't survive the added pressure of fundamental disagreement about the meaning of their loss. The divorce had been amicable but devastating. Two good people who had simply been broken in different ways by the same tragedy. What had emerged from Sarah's crisis of faith was not simply atheism, but a militant intellectual opposition to religious belief that bordered on evangelistic fervor. She threw herself into academic work with the intensity of someone trying to outrun unbearable pain, earning a second PhD in religious studies and beginning to publish papers that systematically dismantled theological arguments with surgical precision. Her personal experience of unanswered prayer and divine silence gave her insights into the psychological mechanisms of faith that purely academic atheists often lacked. Her first book, The God Who Wasn't There, A Mother's Journey from Faith to Reason, had become a bestseller and established her reputation as someone who could argue against religious belief, not from a position of ignorance or hostility, but from the perspective of someone who had believed deeply and been profoundly disappointed. The book's combination of philosophical rigor and raw emotional honesty had resonated with thousands of readers who had experienced their own crises of faith, while simultaneously enraging believers who felt that Sarah was exploiting her personal tragedy for academic gain. Over the following 2 decades, Dr. Williams had refined her arguments and expanded her platform. She had debated bishops, prominent pastors, best-selling Christian authors, and respected theologians, consistently winning not just through superior preparation and intellectual firepower, but through her willingness to expose the emotional and psychological foundations of religious belief. Her debates were not merely academic exercises, They were personal confrontations that left her opponents not just defeated, but fundamentally shaken in their convictions. Her signature argument had become what she called the Emma test, a challenge to believers to explain how a loving, omnipotent God could allow innocent children to suffer and die from painful diseases while remaining worthy of worship and devotion. She had used this argument hundreds of times in debates, lectures, and written works, and had never encountered a response that she considered intellectually honest or emotionally satisfying. Every attempt to answer the problem of evil had struck her as philosophical gymnastics designed to preserve belief in the face of contradictory evidence. When The Chosen began gaining popularity and cultural influence, Dr. Williams had initially ignored it as just another example of Christian entertainment designed to reinforce existing beliefs rather than engage with difficult questions. But as the show's reach expanded, and she began encountering students and colleagues who spoke about it with genuine reverence, she decided to watch several episodes with what she described as anthropological curiosity. What she found was something that surprised and disturbed her, a portrayal of Jesus that was more nuanced and emotionally complex than she had expected, performed by an actor who seemed to bring genuine depth and authenticity to the role. Jonathan Roumie's performance had irritated her precisely because it was so effective. Unlike many religious films and shows that presented sanitized versions of faith that ignored life's complexities, The Chosen acknowledged suffering, doubt, and human frailty while still maintaining its commitment to Christian belief. Jonathan's Jesus was not the serene, otherworldly figure of traditional religious art, but someone who wept with grieving friends, struggled with difficult decisions, and showed genuine compassion for human suffering without always providing easy answers. It was this nuanced portrayal that had prompted Dr. Williams to issue her public challenge. She had watched Jonathan in interviews discussing his faith and his approach to the role, and she had been struck by what seemed like genuine conviction rather than mere professional commitment. Unlike many of the religious leaders she had debated, who often seemed to be defending institutional positions, Jonathan appeared to be speaking from personal belief and experience. This made him either a more formidable opponent or a more vulnerable target. Williams intended to find out which. Her challenge had been posted on her blog under the title, "An Open Letter to the Actor Who Thinks He's Jesus," and it had gone viral within hours. The post laid out her credentials, her personal story, and her challenge to Jonathan to defend his faith in a public forum against someone who understood both the intellectual and emotional dimensions of religious doubt. She had expected him to decline, as most celebrities did when faced with potentially damaging public confrontations. His acceptance and his suggestion that they turn it into a charity fundraiser had both impressed and annoyed her. It was exactly the kind of response that made him a more complex target than she preferred. The debate had been scheduled for a Thursday evening in October, with the university providing Mandel Hall and agreeing to live stream the event for remote viewers. The format would be simple: opening statements from both participants, followed by a moderated discussion that would allow for direct questions and responses, and concluding remarks. Dr. Williams had spent weeks preparing, not just reviewing her standard arguments against religious belief, but studying Jonathan's interviews, watching The Chosen episodes, and developing specific challenges to his particular understanding of Christianity. She had also prepared emotionally for what she knew would be a difficult evening. Using Emma's story as the foundation of her argument always reopened wounds that had never fully healed, but it was also her most powerful weapon against religious belief. She had learned over the years to channel her grief into intellectual precision, to use her pain as fuel for arguments that could cut through the comfortable platitudes and easy answers that so often characterized religious discourse. The evening of the debate, Dr. Williams arrived at the university 3 hours early, spending time in her office reviewing her notes and preparing mentally for the confrontation ahead. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a simple black dress that would remind the audience of mourning while projecting professional authority. She carried a single photograph of Emma in her briefcase, though she didn't plan to use it unless absolutely necessary. The image of her daughter, taken just weeks before the diagnosis, showed a bright-eyed little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile that had once filled Sarah's world with light. As she walked across campus toward Mandel Hall, Dr. Williams felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that accompanied her public debates. She had no doubt about her ability to win the intellectual contest that lay ahead. Her preparation was thorough, her arguments were tested, and her opponent was, ultimately, just an actor without formal theological training. But she also knew that engaging with questions of faith and suffering would require her to revisit the most painful chapter of her life, to once again expose her deepest wounds to public scrutiny in service of what she believed was the greater good of freeing people from religious delusion. Mandel Hall was packed beyond capacity, with additional seating arranged on the stage itself, and hundreds more watching via live stream. The audience was notably diverse: philosophy students and faculty, members of local churches, representatives from both atheist and Christian organizations, and curious members of the public who had been drawn by the unusual nature of the event. The energy in the room was electric, with the kind of anticipation that accompanied sporting events or theatrical premieres rather than academic lectures. Dr. Williams took the stage to polite but reserved applause from an audience that she knew was largely sympathetic to her opponent. She had debated in hostile environments before and actually preferred them. Nothing sharpened her arguments like an audience that wanted to see her fail. Jonathan's entrance generated much more enthusiastic response, though he seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the attention and spent several minutes at the podium in what appeared to be silent prayer. The moderator, Dr. James Patterson from the university's philosophy department, introduced both participants and outlined the format. Dr. Williams would speak first, presenting her case against religious belief, followed by Jonathan's response, and then they would engage in direct dialogue. The ground rules were simple: personal attacks were prohibited, but challenging ideas and beliefs was not only allowed but encouraged. Dr. Williams approached the podium with the confidence of someone who had performed this ritual dozens of times before. Her opening statement would be devastating but controlled, a philosophical argument built on the foundation of personal experience that had never failed to leave her opponents scrambling for adequate responses. She looked out at the sea of faces, many of them young and idealistic, still believing in the possibility of meaning and divine love that she had once shared. What she was about to say would challenge that belief in ways that some of them might never recover from, but she believed it was necessary medicine for minds infected with comforting illusions. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's excellent acoustics, "I stand before you tonight not as someone who has always rejected religious belief, but as someone who once embraced it with the totality of my being. I was not raised in an atheist household or trained from birth to question religious claims. I was a devoted Christian, a woman who prayed daily, attended church weekly, and built my life around the conviction that the universe was governed by a loving God who cared about human suffering and responded to human prayers." She paused, allowing the weight of this confession to settle over the audience. Many of them had probably expected a cold, purely intellectual assault on religious belief. Instead, she was beginning with vulnerability, with the acknowledgement that her position had been earned through experience rather than simply adopted through reasoning. But 25 years ago, that faith was tested in the most fundamental way possible. My 6-year-old daughter Emma was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and for 8 months I watched a beautiful, innocent child suffer in ways that no loving parent should ever have to witness. Emma's faith remained stronger than mine throughout her illness. She prayed for her doctors, she thanked God for small mercies, she maintained hope even as her small body was destroyed by both disease and treatment. Dr. Williams' voice remained steady, but something in her posture suggested the enormous emotional cost of these words. And through it all, I prayed. I prayed with the desperation of someone whose entire worldview depended on the existence of a God who answered prayers and cared about human suffering. I prayed for healing, for comfort, for understanding, for any sign that the universe contained more than random cruelty and biological accident. The audience had grown completely silent, the kind of profound quiet that settles over a room when people realize they are witnessing something more significant than entertainment or academic exercise. Emma died after 8 months of agony, her last conscious words being a question that has haunted me every day since, "Mommy, why won't Jesus help me?" And in that hospital room, holding my daughter's hand as she struggled for each breath, I realized that all the prayers, all the faith, all the theological explanations I had been offered were nothing more than elaborate fantasy, designed to help people avoid confronting the fundamental truth about existence, that we are alone in a universe that is indifferent to our suffering, and that the only meaning we will ever find is the meaning we create for ourselves. Dr. Williams stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her eyes finding Jonathan among the audience. "So tonight, Mr. Roumie, I want you to tell this audience and the thousands watching online where your loving Jesus was when my daughter was dying in agony. I want you to explain how a God, who supposedly has the power to heal the sick and comfort the suffering, allowed an innocent 6-year-old girl to experience pain that would break the spirit of grown adults. I want you to reconcile the Jesus you portray, compassionate, powerful, devoted to healing the broken, with the Jesus who was apparently too busy or too indifferent to answer the prayers of a dying child." The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence. Dr. Williams had delivered variations of this argument hundreds of times, but never with quite this level of raw emotional intensity. The personal nature of the setting, the intimate scale of the auditorium compared to the large conference halls where she usually debated, and perhaps the unusual nature of her opponent had combined to make this feel more like personal confrontation than academic discourse. I have posed this question to bishops, theologians, pastors, and scholars. I have received explanations about free will, about the fallen nature of creation, about God's mysterious plan that we cannot understand with our limited human minds. I have been told that Emma is in a better place, that God needed another angel, that her suffering served some greater purpose that will be revealed in eternity. Her voice took on an edge of controlled fury. But I have never received an answer that demonstrates intellectual honesty, emotional authenticity, or logical consistency. Every response I have encountered has been either cruel in its implications, suggesting that God chose to let my daughter suffer for reasons we cannot comprehend, or meaningless in its evasion of the fundamental question of why an all-powerful, all-loving deity allows innocent suffering. Dr. Williams returned to the podium, gripping its edges as if anchoring herself against the force of memories she had deliberately evoked. "So, Mr. Roumie, you have built a career on portraying divine love and compassion. You have moved millions of viewers to tears with your representation of a Jesus who cares about human pain and has the power to heal it. Now I want you to explain to Emma's mother why that same Jesus was nowhere to be found when she needed him most." The silence that followed was absolute. 800 people seemed to be holding their breath collectively, waiting to see how anyone could possibly respond to such a devastating personal and philosophical challenge. Williams had thrown down a gauntlet that combined intellectual rigor with raw emotional power, demanding not just a theological response, but a human one that could acknowledge the reality of innocent suffering without retreating into comfortable platitudes. Jonathan rose slowly from his chair, his face showing the weight of what he had just heard. He moved to the podium, not with the confidence of someone prepared to deliver a practiced response, but with the careful deliberation of someone approaching sacred ground. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the amplification system and the absolute silence of the audience. "Dr. Williams," he began, "thank you for sharing Emma's story with us. I can't imagine the courage it takes to open that wound in front of strangers, to use your deepest pain as the foundation for this conversation. Before I respond to your question, I need you to know that I'm not going to try to explain away your daughter's suffering or minimize your grief with easy answers." He paused, his hands resting lightly on the podium. "I've spent years studying the character of Jesus, not just for my role in The Chosen, but because I needed to understand how someone could claim to be loving while allowing so much pain to exist. And what I've discovered is that Jesus never promised to eliminate suffering from human experience. What he promised was to be present in it. Dr. Williams' expression showed skepticism bordering on contempt. She had heard variations of this argument before, and her body language suggested she was preparing to dismantle whatever theological construction Jonathan was about to offer. "But that's not actually what you asked me," Jonathan continued. "You didn't ask me to explain suffering in general. You asked me where Jesus was when Emma was dying. And I think the answer to that question might be different than you expect." He stepped away from the podium, moving closer to Dr. Williams and speaking directly to her rather than to the audience. "I think Jesus was in that hospital room with you and Emma. I think he was in every moment you held her hand, every tear you cried, every prayer you whispered even when you felt like you were talking to empty air. I think he was present in every act of love you showed your daughter, every comfort you provided, every sacrifice you made to try to ease her pain." Dr. Williams started to respond, but Jonathan raised his hand gently, asking for permission to continue. "But here's what I think might be the hardest part of my answer to accept. I think Jesus was also suffering with Emma. I don't believe in a God who stands apart from human pain and watches it with divine indifference. I believe in a God who enters into suffering, who experiences it from the inside, who doesn't solve it but transforms it through presence and love." The audience was riveted, but Dr. Williams' expression suggested she was ready to tear apart Jonathan's response with philosophical precision. However, what he said next caught her completely off guard. "Dr. Williams, can I ask you a question?" She nodded, though her posture remained defensive. "In the 25 years since Emma died, how many people have you helped through your grief? How many parents who lost children have found comfort in your writing, your speaking, your willingness to acknowledge that some pain can't be fixed with platitudes?" The question seemed to physically impact Dr. Williams. Her defensive stance softened slightly, though her voice remained guarded. "I don't see how that's relevant to the question of God's existence or character." "I think it's the most relevant thing we could discuss," Jonathan replied, "because I think Emma's death didn't end her impact on the world. It transformed it. Through your grief, through your willingness to speak honestly about loss and doubt, through your refusal to accept easy answers, you've become someone who can minister to other parents in ways that people who haven't experienced that kind of loss simply cannot." Dr. Williams' composure began to crack. "That's not consolation, Mr. Roumie. That's not a reason for a loving God to allow a child to suffer and die." "You're absolutely right," Jonathan said, his voice filled with gentle agreement that seemed to disarm her prepared arguments. "It's not a reason, and it's not consolation. Emma shouldn't have had to die for you to become someone who could help other grieving parents. That's not how love works." He paused, and when he continued, his words carried a weight that suggested they were coming from his own struggles with faith rather than from prepared theological positions. "But maybe the question isn't whether Emma's death was part of some divine plan. Maybe the question is whether love can exist in the midst of meaningless suffering, whether grace can transform even the most senseless tragedies into sources of healing for others, whether God's presence can be found not in the prevention of pain but in the way we respond to it." Dr. Williams stood silent for a long moment, and the audience could see her wrestling with something deeper than intellectual disagreement. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable than it had been all evening. "But I lost my faith, Mr. Roumie. I lost my ability to believe in a God who would allow Emma to suffer like that. How is that a transformation? How is that healing?" Jonathan's response came without hesitation, but with profound gentleness. "Dr. Williams, I don't think you lost your faith. I think your faith evolved. The God you stopped believing in, the one who was supposed to prevent all suffering and answer all prayers according to our wishes, that God needed to die for you to discover a different kind of divine love." He moved even closer, his voice dropping to a conversational level that the microphones barely picked up. "You've spent 25 years fighting for truth, refusing to accept comfortable lies, demanding that people confront reality rather than hiding behind false hope. That sounds like faith to me. Maybe not faith in the God you understood as a young mother, but faith in the importance of truth, in the value of authentic human connection, in the possibility that even our greatest losses can become sources of meaning. Dr. Williams was crying now, tears that seemed to come from a place deeper than intellectual disagreement or public performance. But I don't believe in God anymore. I don't pray. I don't think Emma is in heaven. I don't think there's any cosmic purpose to what happened to her. And maybe that's exactly where you need to be right now, Jonathan said. Maybe your honest atheism is more faithful than my believing Christianity, because at least you're willing to wrestle with the real questions instead of accepting easy answers. What happened next was unprecedented in Dr. Williams' experience of public debate. Instead of trying to win the argument or convert her to his position, Jonathan had created space for her to be exactly where she was, wounded, angry, and searching for truth in the midst of unbearable loss. The validation of her struggle, rather than an attempt to fix or dismiss it, seemed to unlock something that had been frozen inside her for decades. "I miss her so much," she whispered, the words barely audible even with amplification. "Every day for 25 years, I've missed her. And I've been so angry at God, but also so afraid that if I stopped being angry, I would lose the last connection I had to her." Jonathan nodded with understanding. "Anger can be a form of prayer, Dr. Williams. Maybe the most honest prayer there is. Maybe Emma's death wasn't the end of your relationship with God. Maybe it was the beginning of a different kind of relationship, one based on honest questions rather than comfortable answers." The audience watched in stunned silence as one of academia's most formidable atheist intellectuals broke down in front of hundreds of strangers, not because her arguments had been refuted, but because someone had finally acknowledged the legitimacy of her pain without trying to explain it away or minimize its impact. "I don't know how to believe anymore," she said, through tears. "I don't know how to trust a universe that could let something like that happen to someone so innocent." "Then don't," Jonathan replied. "Trust the love you have for Emma instead. Trust the good you've done in her memory. Trust the parents you've helped, who were drowning in the same grief that nearly destroyed you. Maybe that's enough faith for now." The debate, that was supposed to be a confrontation between faith and reason, had become something else entirely. A public meditation on grief, love, and the ways that profound loss can transform rather than simply destroy. Dr. Williams and Jonathan had moved beyond their prepared positions into territory that neither had expected to explore, and the audience found themselves witnessing not an intellectual victory for either side, but a profound human encounter that transcended their initial disagreement. Dr. Williams wiped her tears and attempted to regain her composure. "This isn't how these debates usually go, Mr. Roumie. I came here prepared to demolish your faith, not to have my grief validated by someone I disagree with about fundamental questions of existence." Jonathan smiled for the first time all evening. Maybe that's because this was never really a debate about God's existence. Maybe it was about whether love can survive in a world that breaks our hearts, whether meaning can emerge from meaningless loss, whether two people who disagree about everything can still recognize the sacred in each other's struggles. The formal debate structure had completely dissolved, but neither the participants nor the audience seemed to mind. What was happening felt more important than the intellectual contest they had come to witness. "I still don't believe in God," Dr. Williams said, her voice stronger now. "I still think the problem of evil is insurmountable for any theological system that claims divine omnipotence and perfect love. I still think Emma's death was a meaningless tragedy that shouldn't have happened. And I still believe in a God who suffers with us, rather than solving our problems for us." Jonathan replied, "I still think love can transform even the most senseless tragedies into sources of healing. I still think Emma's life and death have meaning that extends beyond what either of us can understand." They looked at each other across the philosophical divide that separated them, no longer as opponents in an intellectual contest, but as fellow human beings who had been marked by loss and were searching for ways to make sense of existence in a world that often seemed cruel and random. The video of Dr. Williams' breakdown and Jonathan's response went viral within hours, shared millions of times across social media platforms with captions ranging from "Atheist professor destroyed by Christian actor" to "the most beautiful moment of interfaith dialogue ever recorded." But most of the commentary missed the point entirely. This hadn't been about one person converting another or winning an argument. It had been about the possibility of authentic connection across fundamental disagreement, about the way that shared humanity could create understanding even in the absence of shared belief. Dr. Williams returned to her office at the University of Chicago to find hundreds of emails from parents who had lost children, from people struggling with their own crises of faith, from believers and atheists alike who had been moved by her vulnerability and Jonathan's compassion. The response overwhelmed her initially. She had been prepared for intellectual engagement, not for the kind of personal ministry that her openness had inadvertently created. Over the following weeks, Dr. Williams found herself in conversations she had never expected to have. She began corresponding with parents who had lost children, not as an academic expert on religious doubt, but as someone who understood the specific pain of watching a beloved child suffer and die. Her grief, which she had weaponized for decades in service of intellectual arguments, began to transform into something more like pastoral care for others walking similar paths. Jonathan, meanwhile, discovered that his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen had been deepened by his encounter with Dr. Williams. He began to understand his role not just as entertainment or even ministry, but as a bridge between faith and doubt, between those who found comfort in religious belief and those who found truth in acknowledging the absence of easy answers. His performance took on new layers of complexity as he incorporated what he had learned about the difference between solving suffering and being present in it. 6 months after the debate, Dr. Williams published an article in the Journal of Religious Studies titled "Faith After Faith: Atheism as Spiritual Practice." The piece explored the possibility that rigorous doubt could be a form of religious devotion, that questioning God's existence might be a more authentic response to divine mystery than accepting comfortable certainties. The article sparked controversy in both religious and secular academic circles, but it also opened new conversations about the relationship between belief and faith, between certainty and spiritual seeking. She also began speaking at grief counseling conferences and support groups for parents who had lost children, offering not theological comfort, but honest acknowledgement of the ways that profound loss changes people permanently. Her approach, refusing to minimize pain or offer false hope while still affirming the possibility of meaning and connection, proved valuable to many who had been alienated by more conventional forms of religious consolation. Jonathan incorporated elements of their conversation into his ongoing work with The Chosen, suggesting storylines that would explore doubt, grief, and the complexities of faith in more nuanced ways. He also began visiting hospitals and hospices, not as a celebrity making charitable appearances, but as someone who had learned to be present with suffering without trying to fix it or explain it away. The two of them maintained an unlikely friendship, corresponding regularly about questions of faith, doubt, meaning, and loss. Their relationship became a kind of ongoing interfaith dialogue, proving that deep connection could exist between people who disagreed about fundamental questions of existence. They occasionally appeared together at conferences and events, not as debaters, but as conversation partners exploring the intersection of grief, faith, and human resilience. The University of Chicago debate became a case study in communication courses, philosophy classes, and seminary programs across the country, not because it demonstrated how to win arguments about religion, but because it showed what could happen when people approached their deepest disagreements with vulnerability, honesty, and genuine curiosity about each other's experiences. Dr. Williams never returned to religious belief in any conventional sense, but her work took on a spiritual dimension that surprised her colleagues and students. She began exploring what she called atheist spirituality, ways of finding meaning, connection, and even transcendence without belief in God. Her later books integrated her academic expertise with her personal journey through grief and doubt, offering resources for people who found themselves religiously homeless but still searching for significance. Jonathan's portrayal of Jesus continued to evolve, informed by his deepening understanding of how faith and doubt could coexist, how divine love might be expressed, not through the prevention of suffering, but through presence in it. His performance gained layers of complexity that resonated with viewers who were struggling with their own questions about God's character and activity in the world. The debate had achieved something that neither participant had intended. It had created space for honest conversation about the most difficult questions of human existence. Rather than resolving the tension between faith and doubt, it had demonstrated that the tension itself might be where the most important discoveries happen, where authentic spiritual seeking takes place, where human connection transcends ideological difference. Years later, when asked about the debate, Dr. Williams would say that Jonathan Roumie had never convinced her that God exists, but he had shown her that faith could be more complex, more honest, and more beautiful than she had previously understood. She remained an atheist, but an atheist who had been touched by grace, who had experienced something transcendent in the midst of her doubt, who had discovered that love could survive even the death of belief. Jonathan, for his part, would say that Dr. Williams had never shaken his faith in God, but she had deepened his understanding of what divine love might look like in a world marked by suffering and loss. She had taught him that sometimes the most faithful response to tragedy was not acceptance, but protest, not answers, but better questions, not comfort, but the courage to remain present in the face of unbearable pain. Their unlikely friendship became a testament to the possibility that our deepest disagreements might also be our greatest opportunities for connection, that the questions that divide us might actually be the questions that unite us in our shared humanity, our common search for meaning in the face of mystery, our universal need to find love that can survive even in a world that breaks our hearts. The debate that began as a confrontation between faith and reason had become something far more valuable, a demonstration that authentic dialogue was possible, even across the deepest philosophical divides, that vulnerability could create bridges where arguments built walls, and that sometimes the most profound spiritual moments happen not when we find answers, but when we find the courage to ask better questions together. Emma's death, which had driven her mother away from faith 25 years earlier, had ultimately become the catalyst for a kind of healing that neither conventional religion nor secular rationalism could have provided alone. Through her mother's honest struggle and her willingness to remain open to surprise, Emma's brief life had touched thousands of people she would never meet, had sparked conversations about faith and doubt that would continue long after the debate was forgotten, and had proven that love really can transform even the most senseless suffering into sources of hope for others walking similar paths. In the end, perhaps that was answer enough.